accelerator in all of North America. So we're pretty proud of the work that we do and in bringing the community together for a great initiative just like this. So as you know, we're here to be discussing universal design today, which is a huge topic in tech and in startups and in design for our world just in general. So we figured we wanted to bring some attention to the topic, and we've assembled a great lineup today to discuss the issues. So the first person I'd like to introduce you to is our moderator, the Honorable David Onley. So following a distinguished career as a broadcaster, Mr. Onley was appointed Ontario's 28th Lieutenant Governor. As the first Lieutenant Governor with a physical disability, he adopted accessibility as the overarching theme of his mandate. He's now Special Advisor on Accessibility to the Minister of Economic Development, Employment and Infrastructure, with a special focus on how to improve employment opportunities for people with disabilities. This is the first time a portion of the accessibility file has been placed in an economic ministry and not only with social services. Mr. Onley believes that true accessibility occurs when people with disabilities can fully participate in the social, cultural, and economic life of Ontario. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Onley. And of course, we have an incredible lineup of panelists today. So John Lowen is the design lead at Perkins & Will. He's an architectural designer working in the academic and cultural sectors with a particular focus on higher education and library facilities. John's current projects include the Ryerson University Church Street development, Meadowvale Community Center and library master plans for the Universities of Saskatchewan, Rochester, and McMaster. John is the occasional guest critic at the Ryerson School of Architecture, Ryerson School of Interior Design, and Waterloo School of Architecture. Mayan Ziv is the founder and Mayan Ziv is the founder and CEO of Access Now. Mayan is an activist, photographer, and entrepreneur. Living with muscular dystrophy, Mayan understands the importance of accessibility in our world. Mayan is a graduate of the Masters of Digital Media program at Ryerson University and is a resident company here at the DMZ. And her goal is to bring awareness and change to disability matters. Mayan's work has been recognized with the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal, and you've probably seen her all across the show in media as well. Nadia Hamilton is the founder and CEO of Magnus Mode. Nadia has spent over 10 years advocating for her brother who has autism and providing therapy and services for other families impacted by ASD. She's passionate about helping people with special needs to live happy, full, and meaningful lives in their communities. She's an experienced, accredited support worker with training in applied behavioral analysis. And just a quick update to our panel. Actually, we were going to welcome Brad Ross, who's the Executive Director of Corporate Communications for the TTC. But due to a family emergency, he wasn't able to join us today, but we wish him and his loved ones well. So please welcome our panelists to the stage. Just before we actually officially kick off the discussion, we are absolutely tech-focused and love to invite you to join us in the conversation online. So our hashtag of the day is DMZ session to follow along with the discussion online. Thank you so much again for joining us today, and enjoy the festivities.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for being here, and thank you to all our panelists and sharing their expertise. So today, we really do want to address the concept of universal design, something that has become increasingly important as we've been moving forward in the whole process of accessibility, which of course is something that originally came from the concept of disability rights. So we can go back 30 years when that phrase was being booted around, and then we moved to the concept of accessibility, and accessibility tended to mean just physical improvements. And so when you would say accessibility, even 10 years ago, people might think of ramps or automatic doors, these type of changes, physical changes to the immediate environment that definitely improved the situation for many people with physical disabilities, or for those of us like Mayan and myself who used assistive devices. So these would include curb cuts, obviously, as well. As time has moved on, though, we're changing our definitions, or new definitions are coming into play to better describe the modern reality that we're living with and experiencing and building forward in, and that is really where we're at today in the concept of universal design. So, John, I'm going to put you on the spot, because you're the closest, but can you give us a sense of what universal design is and how it does differ from accessibility?
I think so. I mean, can you all hear me? All right. I would say in our work, we tend to think about the difference between accessibility and universal design. Really, I mean, there's a difference in scope and there's a difference in intent, but it's really about the difference between accommodation versus inclusion. So we would try and focus our work on inclusion more than simply accommodating. That means making sure that access isn't constrained for physical reasons, but equally making sure that we're not denying people opportunities to participate due to issues of cognitive issues, mental health issues, socioeconomic marginalization. So taking a much broader approach and a broader understanding of what it means to participate and what it means to be given the opportunity.
Lonnie or Ryan, whichever one, would you like to add to that?
Sure, yeah, I can add to that. So I guess I'm going to leave with an example of what I think of. So there's this aquarium in Toronto, which you might have been to, and it's the Ripley's Aquarium, and I recently went there as part of a radio show that I was doing for CBC to explore inclusive spaces. And what we did was we just explored the environment. And what became apparent as we went through the path was that every individual, regardless of whether they had a disability or not, was able to fully be included in all of the experience. So it wasn't about, here is a set of specific features for this other group. It was about creating an environment where every person, regardless of whatever their needs were, could be included in that. So when I think of universal design or inclusive design, I think of an environment that facilitates that to the best of its abilities to do so.
Can you hear me? Okay, good. Hello. When I think of universal design, my mind goes immediately to my own brother. He has autism, and growing up with him, I became very, very aware immediately of all of the places and all of the ways in the community, in the city and beyond, that weren't inclusive, that did not have the support or the services that were needed to guide somebody like him to enjoy the services fully. So, I drew a list in my head, kind of, going from day to day of, okay, so he can't go in there because he doesn't like the sound, it hurts his ears, or this place is, poses sensory problems, etc. So universal design is something that, and accessibility is something that our company, Magnus Mode, leverages technology to transform the spaces in the community to make them more accessible for people like my brother.
So what do you think has changed in the last number of years? Why have you made this shift? Why has universal design become something that everyone's focusing on? Can you pinpoint it to an event or a circumstance?
I think awareness has improved in general. I think when you look at social media, you look at World Autism Awareness Month, more people are becoming more aware that people are different and people require different supports or different perspectives to fully engage in an environment or participate. And so I think the awareness is a huge factor. And I would also say that, I think it's a changing mindset that comes, the transformation of an ethos that comes with the awareness as well. So there's a saying that goes, everybody knows somebody with a cognitive special need, and I think that more people are becoming aware that of challenges that aren't particularly visible. So that's great.
Yeah, and I think that there's been a recent push or a trend towards recognizing the power of diversity overall. So regardless of, again, I'm saying regardless of disability, there's strength in bringing other perspectives to the table. So whether that is you being a business owner or you just creating an event or whatever the circumstances are, there's been a lot more focus, and definitely in the media, on the importance of diversity. And I think inclusion is a big part of that.
John, right from the very beginning, in terms of architecture and design, it's always easier to build it in instead of trying to add it on.
Yeah, I mean that's undoubtedly true. I think the flip side of that is perhaps that sometimes the great can be the enemy of the good in that kind of issue. We see like the stopgap program, which I think probably everybody is familiar with in the city of Toronto. Now, that may not be the single best way of increasing physical access to a building, but it's a heck of a lot better than not doing anything at all. And so I think it's always important to keep in mind what we have the opportunity to change right now and make a meaningful difference right away, and not get sidetracked by a kind of idealized thing. The other point I would make on that is part of the reason it can be a challenge retrofitting or thinking differently about the way we increase access to the facilities and buildings that we're working on is the cost of inclusion and the cost of change is very easy to tabulate and to measure. The cost of exclusion is an opportunity cost, and it's very hard to track that in advance. And so it's something that we always need to keep in mind. We tend to overweight the costs that we're aware of, and we really underweight the costs of exclusion simply because we don't see them until they're too late.
I can give a perfect example of that, of a story that Rick Hansen told a group of people when he was in Toronto some time ago, and that was being in Ottawa at a function, and he and 6 other athletes who were able-bodied, there's a reason I mentioned that, which I'll get to in just a second, decided to go to a restaurant which was promoted as being accessible. And when they got to the restaurant, indeed there was an automatic button to have the door open automatically, and they got in to the lobby area and were immediately confronted by a flight of 6 stairs. And I'm just like dumbfounded at this. And so a lot of umbrage was taken at that moment. Some of the people said, let's leave, we'll just go somewhere else. They were all hungry. And they just said to Rick, look, we'll just pick you up and bring you up the stairs. And okay, so up the stairs they went as these 5 guys hefted him in his wheelchair up to the top. And then the manager comes and sees him at the top of the stairs and is just thrilled. He's elated that Rick Hansen has come to his restaurant and asked for his autograph and everything. And Rick says, well, I'm only here because I had 5 guys that could carry me up the stairs. And he said, you really need to make this place accessible. And you've got a button at the front. And he said, yeah, we've really been meaning to do that, but we just don't get any people in wheelchairs coming here. So at that point, Rick said he realized there was just no point in continuing the discussion with this person. So unfortunately, that does seem to be the case, even if you're Rick Hansen. So are there user experiences and pitfalls that should be avoided? Anything a startup should absolutely stay away from? I don't know, Maddie, maybe you're the...
Well, I think it's really important when you're designing any technology or any program from the ground up to be accessible to involve the people that you're designing it for. I think that the more that you can engage and ask questions and get feedback around what their needs are, the more accessible your outcome or the finished product is going to be. So I think that that's something to avoid, is to be in a box creating. I was lucky, I guess I had 20 plus years with my brother experience, but I also worked in the community with others affected by a variety of needs and challenges, and I was able to engage them in the process of building our tool. So I think it's really important to work together with the individuals you're trying to create the product for, but also with subject matter experts like Autism Ontario, Geneva Center for Autism, that could provide great feedback. So collaboration is key.
Yeah, and to kind of echo that, something that I hear everywhere in the startup world is talk to your customers. Go out, get out of the building, and actually ask people what they want. And they think that that's everyone. So there's often kind of responding to that comment of, well, we don't get people with disabilities coming. Well, yeah, because you have 6 steps. You know, like if you proactively reduce the level of assumptions you might have about who your user might be and actually ask authentic questions and listen to the responses, I think doesn't matter what you're building, you're going to get a better solution that way. And it comes down to good customer service.
I think listening also takes many forms too, because sometimes the customers you're trying to create for, perhaps they're nonverbal, or perhaps they don't communicate in traditional ways. So listening will mean stepping outside of yourself and really listening with your heart and with your mind and with other aspects to get a fuller picture and understanding of their experience in the community and in the world.
Good points. In terms of physical design, how can that impact the workplace culture itself, just the whole experience?
I mean, I think in some sense forming a workplace culture is the central challenge of workplace design. And you can think about a workplace as it's a physical embodiment that choreographs the way that people interact with each other and the way that they interact with their work and whatever they're pursuing. So it's kind of hard to overstate the importance of the kind of physical embodiment of a culture. And I think that's really, maybe that word embodiment is what it comes down to, rather than just espousing a series of values. It's the design of the workplace that ends up embodying them, making them turning them from a set of ideas into a set of lived and choreographed experiences.
Yeah, so with Access Now, physical infrastructure is kind of the initial starting point with what we're doing. So if you're not familiar with Access Now, we're basically crowdsourcing information that's rating and sharing experiences based on the level of access of places everywhere. And something, like I've had this experience all the time, but something that it's not often intentional, but what happens is when you show up at a location, imagine for a second that you show up at a place with a bunch of people and everybody gets to go through the front door and they're greeted with this beautiful foyer and there's flowers that are freshly cut and it's this great event and the lighting is like, everything's perfect and wonderful. And there's been a lot of attention to make that experience great for you. But you, as opposed to everyone else you're with, is greeted not that way. You are asked to go around the side of the building and enter through the garbage entrance. So it's not an intentional reality, but the fact is that a lack of accessibility often results in a lack of balance in inequality. And that's, for me, a major point in the importance of accessible design and physical infrastructure. Is that it's a human right for everybody to be treated the same and feel the same when they enter any space. And for me, I think that I can't stress that enough. The importance of awareness building to get to the point where you realize the implications of a non-accessible space.
I think when you were talking just now, what flashed through my mind was how the parallel between having to go around the side of the building today and maybe the experience faced by African Americans in the 50s and 60s. It's a new kind of, or not even new, but it's discrimination. And it takes a time, you have to build awareness of the experience of certain people in society, and in order to be able to affect that change. I think it's really an interesting parallel.
John, this probably relates more to you than to the others, but everyone can join in, obviously. When you are starting from scratch in terms of the design of a building, what is it in your mind that starts to make it accessible? What is the start point?
Well, I think in general with us, the start point for our process is it's not so much about thinking how can we make this building accessible. Of course we're going to do that, and you wouldn't ask how are we going to make this building fireproof, how are we going to make this building structurally sound. It's just an expectation that that is one of the functions of designing a physical structure in a building. But I think it starts with thinking quite deeply and quite strategically about what the purpose of the building is. And I'll give you an example. We're working on the Church Street development, which is currently a great big hole somewhere about 2 blocks that way. The Daphne Cockwell School of Health Sciences. And you know, one way to think about that as a building is it's a series of classrooms and offices and a residence and some other things that need 4 walls and a roof. So that's fine. How do we make sure that everybody can access those things? But a kind of broader and more strategic way of thinking about that is what is this building going to do for Ryerson and the campus and the way that the Ryerson campus connects to the city, and how is including the city of Toronto in the activities and explorations that Ryerson is undergoing a way of kind of increasing accessibility at a much higher level. So I think it's really about thinking strategically about what we're trying to achieve and not merely thinking about physical or sensory cognitive issues in that way.
So, Diane and Nadia, how do we then make sure design or universal design is then inclusive for all groups?
Well, I think all groups should be involved in the initial conversations. So, you know, that way, when you're laying the foundation, you have the opinions of all people that might be accessing the building, and you're laying the groundwork for a more inclusive finished product. It's very similar to when you're creating technology, actually. And I think that the way that a city, if you just look out the window there and all these wonderful buildings and everything, and you just imagine that most of them would not be accessible for people with cognitive special needs today. I think that the doors need to open and the barriers need to decrease. And yes, it's great to do that from the start when you're building new things, but we need to proactively engage, and this is just what Magnismo does, proactively engage every single corporation and organization in the community, because we all have a role to play in the building of a more accessible city and a more accessible global community.
Yeah, I think us designers, we tend to get in a lot of trouble when we presume we know how somebody is going to use a space, use a facility, how they're going to engage with something that we're working on, and making sure that those people are at the table from the point at which the project is conceived, rather than just there in a kind of review capacity afterwards. It's critical.
And I can add a personal example to that. I went to this meeting the other day in quite an old building, and there was an elevator, but the buttons to actually tell the elevator where to go were so high up. And like, I have a tall chair so I can elevate, but I'm thinking, like, if you're a wheelchair user, like when you're sitting, you're at a lower perspective. So whoever built this elevator didn't actually think of the use case. So yeah, like, don't build and then test while you build, so that you're not falling into those pitfalls all the time.
Measure twice, cut once. It's an old concept. Are any of you finding a difference in terms of dealing with the public sector versus the private sector in any aspect of universal design or accessibility? Who's doing a better job? Or feel free to slide whoever you wish to slide.
Okay. Well, we're currently working with Tim Hortons and Rogers Communications. I think that a lot of corporations are now recognizing the strengths, first of all, of having a universal experience, and they're proactively seeing that in engaging and making their services and products more accessible, they can in fact become better companies and better workplaces. And so I think that those companies are doing a good job. We're working with lots of transit organizations like Guelph Transit, Grand River. They're really recognizing the need, and I think a lot needs to happen, but at least they're in the headspace. I'm not sure about who's not doing a good job, but
I can speak to that.
Yeah.
Okay, well, where do we start? No. So, looking at the public sector, yes, there are standards put in place to get us to the point where we will be inclusive and accessible. You might have said something to the point of how behind we are in actually achieving those goals. So yes, purpose is there. There's the, yeah, we want to. Yes, it's important, but the actual action plan. And I think that's where the private sector can be more involved. So what we're doing with Access Now is trying to create a space where both the private and the public sectors can come together. There's a really strong case to be made when you look at business about how, down to the bottom line of it can do good to your business on a business sense, in terms of profit, to be accessible. And I think that, the concept we don't have accessible, we don't have people with disabilities coming, so we don't need to create an accessible space. Well, yeah, but I am going to come with a group of 6 people, let's say, and if your space is not accessible, you've lost my business and all the people that I'm with. So bringing a higher level of awareness to business owners about the importance of accessibility for their business, and not just it's a nice to have or it's the right thing to do, it's actually the smart thing to do.
If I could just add briefly to that, every single time I go out in the community with my brother, or my family's with him, and he wants to, let's say, go to KFC, we are all going to KFC. So he's dictating the purchasing decision of an entire support network, which is really important for businesses to recognize. And if they're not accessible, he's not going there. And so, this is what Magnus Mode engages these organizations and helps them see the benefit of inviting and engaging new people across the ability of the spectrum of ability. And we've made some good traction along the way, but we are really looking to engage every single organization and corporation in Canada and beyond.
Yeah, I would say, we do a lot of work in both the public and the private sector, and of course there's a drastic range in each side in terms of the kind of awareness and commitment to taking a more radical approach to inclusivity. But I would say the very cutting edge is generally we're seeing it's coming from the private sector, where people are seeing radical inclusivity as a strategic advantage, either in terms of the people that they can hire, the customers or constituents, participants who are engaging with them. That kind of awareness and that strategic thinking about making things more inclusive, that's stronger on the private side than the public.
Definitely.
So ideally, universal design is built in from the start. But we have a significant amount of infrastructure that the universal design concept wasn't around. And so now we're working backwards. The company is trying to adapt to the physical plant that they've got. What are the challenges involved in retrofit?
They're substantial. Yeah, they're big. But I would say, of course, when you have a box and you're not making the box any bigger, it's hard to fit more stuff in it. So there's a basic spatial constraint when we're talking about buildings and capital projects. But I think there's a conceptual constraint that is much greater, and that's the fact that you look at what exists and what's built. And I think this may be true equally true for an app as it is for a building. As soon as you have a thing that exists that tweaks you as to what could exist, it starts to kind of limit the conceptual possibilities. And we see a lot of our, particularly again, the private clients, it's not just about changing the kind of spatial framework that they occupy, but it's about changing the way they operate, reconceptualizing how they organize their business and how they organize their workplace as a result. It's that kind of creative thinking at the highest level that is both the biggest challenge, but also the biggest opportunity. That's where you can kind of make something from nothing.
And to echo that, I often say that disability in my own life has offered me an opportunity to be creative, because I show up somewhere and it's just not what I expect, so I have to then repurpose things or get creative about how I'm going to do what I want to do. So that's just on a personal level, but I think if you expand that to consider, let's say you're a business owner, so so many places have that bathroom downstairs. And it's not accessible, and trying to retrofit that is a massive challenge. But rather than just being like, oh, well, we can't, that's it, goodbye, like that's not really a creative approach to creating further inclusion. So I think it's recognizing, like, how can we get creative about these constraints? So let's say your specific business doesn't have an accessible washroom. Maybe 2 doors down, there is a space that does. And so letting your customers know about that is a step towards greater inclusion and greater accessibility. And it's just about kind of stepping outside of that box to think, what can I do that is not just limited to my own space, and connecting to others to solve those issues?
And I think in terms of large corporations or businesses that are currently not accessible, I think one of the challenges is recognizing the need, but also prioritizing it and recognizing that it should be a priority on your list. A lot of the times when maybe we call a restaurant or a bank and we say, okay, we have this app and you can use the app to make your site more accessible for people with autism, they say, oh, well, that sounds great, but we've got so many initiatives on the go for our neurotypical customers that we don't really have time this year or next year or the year after to get that started. So once you start telling them about the benefits of it being inclusive, they start to come around a little bit. But it's still not at the forefront. It's still not, the level of awareness around what inclusivity and universalization of your site or your service can do for your business is not totally clear.
I'm going to take questions from the audience in the next couple of minutes, so if you've got any, this is definitely your time coming up in just a few minutes. I'd like to talk just briefly about a broader question, and that is here in Ontario, we're the jurisdiction that has the completely definitive Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. And while there's no specific provision that says thou shalt implement universal design, it's clearly had an overall impact in terms of the thought process of the culture. What would be some of the impact perhaps that you've seen or experienced simply in the greater marketplace simply because of the existence of the act?
I can leave that off just because I've experienced the direct impact. Newer places are more accessible. So every time something new comes up, there's a mostly higher level of awareness that this is something that needs to be done. Versus, experiencing places that are much older, if you're going to heritage buildings, the experience of access is a lot more challenging. So just strictly when bringing up the Ripley's example, that, and speaking to the president of Ripley's, he said, the first one we did, it was okay, but by the third aquarium we built, we integrated universal design directly from the ground up into our approach. And I, as a customer, have experienced that. So I'd say that there is definitely a positive change that's come from that, and I'd like to see that expand now to all of Canada and not just Ontario.
I think more companies are becoming proactive in that it's not mandated now, but a lot of, we talk to, like I mentioned, different companies like restaurants and hospitals and transit, etc. And there's this push towards, well, maybe it's not mandated now, but in a couple of years, in order to retrofit, that's going to be really expensive. So we might as well put the procedures in place now. So a lot of corporations I've talked to are, they just said, we just finished doing this to our site. We want to be W3C compliant. We want to have this and this and this in place by 2017. These are strategic objectives that are coming into fruition, and I think the AODA had a large part in encouraging that. But again, it's limited, the amount of businesses that are moving towards this. And although awareness is growing, companies like Magnus Mode and the wonderful companies here are doing their part in raising that awareness and really communicating the benefit and the value of doing it now.
Yeah, I would add to that. You guys were very positive about it, and I do think it's made a big difference, but so now I get to be a bit critical. I would say that the nature of legislation is it changes slowly, right? We update the building code twice a decade, and perceptions are changing much faster than that. Understanding, the cutting edge at least, is also changing much faster than that. And I think there is, the AODA is a kind of a necessary piece, but what it doesn't do is require an understanding of why we're doing these things, right? So it always, this kind of outreach and this kind of event is the other half of the pie, as it were, because we see a lot of clients who know what they have to do, but they don't know why they have to do it. And if you're not thinking about the why, if it's not intentional, if it's just box checking, you're not going far enough.
Yeah, and to echo that, like in my experience, the thought leaders or the people who've really made like amazing efforts to accessibility or inclusive design are the ones who've had some deeper or more personal understanding of the issue. So they go, like my grandmother was recently, she had an accident, now she's using a wheelchair. I want my business to be accessible because of my grandmother. And then they'll go out and educate themselves on what to do. But the why is actually the motivation for doing it. So rather than like, oh, we have to, it's I want to, and here are all the tools to make it happen. I think absolutely.
And then here are the economic benefits of doing the right thing. I recall giving a speech to the Empire Club during my term as Lieutenant Governor, and I rattled off the economic advantages of hiring people with disabilities. And so it was very generous applause at the end of the speech, and it came back to the table that we were at, and one of the great financial icons of our country, I won't mention his name right now, but he just congratulated me on the speech, but before he even said congratulations, he said, oh, I get it. You do the right thing and make more money. And I said, yes, that's it exactly. That's exactly what happens. Do the right thing and make more money. So, you win your victories one at a time. Are there questions now from the audience? We have individuals with microphones. These are who will come to you, so just raise your hand. I mean, these are individuals who've gone through the process of startups and are making a real success of it. So this is your opportunity. Just back on the right there, yes. Yeah, that's you.
Thank you so much for...
Mic's not on, so I'll try this.
I think, yeah.
Oh, there you go.
Thank you so much for being here today. I have a question for Natalie or anyone else who could...
Nadia.
Nadia, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Nadia, you mentioned briefly having universal design and how that translates online into the digital space, specifically for autism. Could you maybe expand on that a little bit about how we can make our websites or apps more inclusive in that sense?
Well, let's see. The autism spectrum is very large, like it's very broad. So there's all sorts of abilities and challenges along the way. That makes designing tools or apps for people with autism very, very difficult. But one of the things that I did was draw from personal experience. And I know that my brother and the people that I've worked with as an instructional therapist were very, very visually minded. So they learned very well through visual instruction. And my brother is not a strong reader, so we try to include in our app not so much words or words that correspond with pictures so that he can follow along. In our app also we have different modes of communication. So there's the visual, there's the written, but there's also the audio. So including all sorts of ways, Braille might be one, sign language. So just kind of accounting for the range of ways of accessing and digesting information is important. So we actually use this in the format of a baseball card. It's a digital baseball card, and you've got the image, you've got the photo, you've got the text, you've got the audio, and then it walks you through step-by-step instructions, which is another popular way of instructing people with autism, is by providing very, very detailed, but simple and easy to follow, step-by-step instructions for how to do things like brush your teeth or take the bus or go to Tim Hortons. So that's how we engage corporations, is by making their own digital card decks that are collectible and usable by people on the spectrum.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, thanks again. That was similar to my question to Nadia about, just expanding on how autism can be, you can sort of engage with that discussions in that space with digital technology. And I know we've talked a lot about physical space and the limitations, but I just wanted to ask everyone if they could comment on that sort of a digital shift. Is things easier having going online? Speaking from the banking perspective, rather than going into a branch where there might be difficulties physically, you can do just about anything online, and we're working every day to improve that experience. Just a comment on maybe some improvements you've seen there, because we've talked a lot about
Yeah.
the physical today.
Sure. So I didn't know how to code or how to build an app or how to do anything technical before I started working on Access Now. And so it was quite an education for me, just to figure out what is involved in making tech accessible. And so, simple things like describing images in alt text is a huge advantage, but also just, again, the concept of retrofitting applies to tech and the digital world as well. So if you build your app and then you go, oh, now I'm going to add accessibility to it, chances are it's not going to be a very accessible or good experience for your user. And a great example of a company that's done a very good job at integrating accessibility would be Apple. So rather than Apple, creating everything that they do and go, here's all the accessible stuff after, accessibility is ingrained in the culture. It's in your phone, for example. Accessibility is not an add-on, it's part of the experience. And so it's there, regardless of whether you need it or not. So there are entire standards just devoted to web and tech accessibility. And I won't go into all of them, but if you come from that mindset of I want from the ground up this to be accessible to everyone, there are the tools out there, and there are incredible meetup groups. Even there's an incredible community of people here in Toronto who focus just on accessible tech. Go out, find them, talk to them, and you can learn so much. And that's how I did it. That's how I started.
My question, I guess, is for everybody. Would you say that it's possible for a space to be completely accessible to all different types of people? And if not, then what would you say the goal, I guess, or the immediate goal for universal design would be?
That's a great question. I would go back to Nadia's point about redundancy. And it's, I think, it's like I said earlier, we can't predict how everybody is going to need to use or want to use every space that we create. It's not possible. And even if you've done a very good job of getting all the right people at the table, human beings are a wonderful and diverse group, and there's always going to be some other need or want. So I think rather than thinking about focusing on providing for each specific need, it's about redundancy of opportunities to engage with the space or kind of maximize your use of the space, and giving people choice in a range of opportunities rather than trying to solve problems one by one.
Hi, I'd just like to respond to that in another way as well. Here at Ryerson, I'm the accessibility coordinator here at Ryerson, and we have some 10 principles and values that underpin what we're doing and how we're doing it. And one of them is that we make a distinction between accessibility and accommodation. Those terms are often used interchangeably, and we say that they need to work together. They're not enemies, but there's a relationship between the two. So the more accessibility you have, the less individual accommodation you need. But some folks will always need some accommodation in some circumstances. So we say that good accommodation is part of accessibility. So you can't, some people criticize the concept of universal design because they say you're creating something that doesn't fit anybody exactly right. But what you're doing is building in as much accessibility from the start, and then you have a mindset and creativity to accommodate where you need to, and you welcome that. So I would say, think about it that way.
That's a very good point. One of the things that we built into our app is, I mean, your universalization is difficult because everybody's unique. So customization and the ability to utilize and leverage technology to be able to customize and create a support that suits you is something that we built into our application as well. So, for example, somebody's experience going to Rockefeller Center in New York may be totally different than yours or mine. And they can customize the support tool that they need, maybe their parent or their caregiver, by adding their own photos and their own text and their own audio. So this is, if you're experiencing anxiety in this situation, maybe you can try this. Because I know that when my brother experiences anxiety, he likes to squeeze one of his little squeezy things. But when I experience anxiety, I like to eat. So, you know, it's just different. It's learning about what works from a personal perspective and being able to leverage the tools available to you and to society to account for a variety of needs.
Hello, is this on?
Yep.
As I was listening to the conversation, it seems to be very much about here in Toronto, Ontario, and yet there's a whole big world out there. And so my question is to each of you, where are beacons in the world in terms of universal access, whether it's on the architectural front or other instances besides Apple? Where are the beacons that are pointing the way forward for all of us on this?
Well, my company. I'll just say my company is, we're focused and dedicated on doing that and becoming a beacon for changing the way that people with cognitive special needs live in the real world, in the world itself. Just got back from Vietnam, who are going to be adapting our tool to their environment as well, and also in the States. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity worldwide, and the mandate and the mindset is shifting worldwide to a more global approach to accessibility. Other beacons I'd say that inspire us are, I love organizations that work hands-on with people with special needs, and I think that even though they're not necessarily leveraging technology in the way that we are, they are at the forefront of trying to include and make spaces more accessible by pushing the envelope and saying, hey, we've got this large group of people who can't access your services. What can we do? How can we work together? So I think that they're on the ground, and I've been there on the ground with them, and it's a difficult job, but they're definitely pushing the envelope, and I admire that.
To add, to give you a little bit of examples. So something at Access Now that we love to do is celebrate and promote any company or individual or organization that is working towards accessibility, and whatever that means to them. And kind of going back to something we spoke about earlier is that in general, and definitely within the last year or so, there's been more awareness and there's been more momentum coming from larger brands to recognize the importance of accessibility. So an example would be like something that kind of blew my mind this week is that I was reading about Toyota just recently announced that there's this wheelchair that's been climbing stairs for like a decade, okay? And like it didn't really take off, and it was clunky, and it was like ahead of its time. It's called the iBot. And then Toyota announced that they were gonna remake this. So hearing a car company recognize opportunity in quite a different market, for me, is like an amazing signal. Ford did the same thing. Now they're building accessible cars rather than modifying them after, and it's on a commercial level. So, and Nike did the same thing with a sneaker. that was designed specifically from a use case of an individual who had CP and had difficulties tying shoelaces. So you'll see these little stories, and what I'm hoping and I'm predicting is that it's not going to be anymore the one-offs, like look at this trophy story of this inspirational whatever. Like that's a nice story, but it's an old story. I'm like, the hero idea is done. I'm done with it. Then the next level is companies integrating these ideas into their products, their services, their overall culture. So if you start looking into it, there are great examples that are popping up, and I'm hoping that we'll see a lot more of them. So every single person here, regardless of what you're building or making or want to do, accessibility and these kinds of conversations are a great starting point to think of how you can innovate a space and a market that's growing and becoming pretty influential, I would say.
I think it goes back to the question about whether we were seeing more innovation in the public or the private sector, and I would really reiterate that it's the private sector. I mean, in Ford's case, there's nothing like staring down the barrel of Uber and self-driving cars to really make you want to think creatively about how you're going to hold on to your market. Or in the case of like the Nike shoe that you mentioned, Adidas has now got a self-lacing, self-tightening shoe that's sold, and that's sold as kind of, it's a bit like do the right thing and make your money, right? Because that's a very high-performing athletic feat, but it's something that anybody can put their foot in and use. So we're seeing more from the private sector than the public, and I think it's coming more out of competition and a strategic desire to innovate than it is out of regulations and laws.
So Rich Donovan is a name known to many of you, and is the chair of the province's Accessibility Standards Advisory Council. And he's the one that demonstrated it first presented, I believe, I'm not sure there may have been others, but some 8 or 9 years ago, was to just how vast the quote-unquote accessibility market was, that while government will, of all stripes, whether it's this province or throughout most North American jurisdictions, will quote something between 15 or 16% of the population having some kind of a disability, typically half being some kind of physical disability and half being some kind of invisible disability, so-called. But it's to Diane's point about the restaurant example, it's when you include the family members of the individuals with disability that the number becomes galvanizing for corporations, and that number is 53% of the population are either affected by disability or an immediate family member has a disability. So for economic reasons, it makes sense. I guess that's why we're seeing it.
I would add to that, it's something we haven't talked a lot about, but disability is both relative, but it's also time-based. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard this idea that we're all temporarily abled, right? But I'm one car door from going over the handlebars of my bike, and then having to find a whole different way to get around the city for the next 6 or 8 weeks. And that's true of all of us. So a kind of a growing recognition that it's not just the 53% who are impacted on a day-to-day basis, but that some of these things can happen to any of us over the course of our lifetimes.
And especially as we grow old, right?
Yeah.
Cognitive special needs can affect anyone. Dementia, Alzheimer's, that sort of thing is a reality. And so, I think it's natural for us to start thinking about it as something that is, everybody has a responsibility and a role. And a lot of the times people say, well, that doesn't affect me, it's not important, it's a really bad problem, but good luck with that. But no, it affects every single person in one way or the other. So I think it's the awareness needs to tie into not that people exist with disabilities, but that we all have know somebody who is who has challenges, and we may face those challenges too. So it's a human rights issue, but it's a humanity-wide issue.
And I'd expand that even further to say that whether you think you have a disability or not, you're using accessible features. Like every single time you cross the street and you see a curb cut, that's accessibility. Every time you're on the bus and you hear the announcements of what stop is coming up, that's accessibility. So you benefit from accessibility every day in your life, whether or not you realize that you do. And so if we think about, the self-tying shoelaces, that's accessibility, so let's just keep running with that theme and make everything just awesome.
I was at a conference in Ottawa a couple of weeks ago. It was at the Carleton University on accessibility, and they made a very, the hostess made a very telling comment at the beginning about accommodation. And so she said, we have a range of people here today. Some of us are in wheelchairs and scooters, and others who are walking. We just want you to know that we have accommodated your needs by providing chairs. And so, you know, and for those of you who have hearing, we have also provided a sound system. And she went down the line of all the different accommodations, quote unquote, that were being provided. And it was just purely a matter of one's perspective, looking at the different directions.
I'd say my apartment would have no seating if I didn't know people who needed it. Like it would just be empty and it would just be my chair.
Yeah.
So you're welcome that there is a couch here.
If there are any further questions?
So you,
Yes.
hi. You touched on this a bit, and you touched on the sort of issues that get raised and the issues that don't get solved when you design in response to specific issues rather than designing with universal usability in mind. I was wondering, because you provided quite a lot of physical examples as well as tech examples, but if you had any more tech-specific examples of sort of fundamental concepts or standards that might need to be challenged in order to have this universal design from the get-go. Or assumptions in the way that we create and design tech products.
Good question.
Yeah.
No, this is the dumb architect taking a guess. Right? But I would say my experience of using the internet and my phone is highly, highly visual. And the kind of other sensory inputs or other modes of accessing those informations are really lagging behind. I don't know how you guys.
Yeah, so there's two kind of things that I can add in terms of feature sets for accessibility. So one is contrast. So when you design any visual, it's important to have contrast in how you create it. And then another one is just when you actually write code, you can write code to be accessible or you can write it to be inaccessible to things like screen readers. So that if I am using a screen reader to go through an app or through a website, if it's written in a way that a screen reader can understand and identify targets or text alt for images, it's a much more accessible experience for a user than it would be if you wrote your whole platform in a way that didn't actually accommodate that. So those are two brief examples, and there are many more.
I think also an attention to what sort of devices people are using. So are they using Apple products, Android products, maybe only desktops, maybe some sort of other assistive technology. So I think getting to know your audience is really key again. And I also think when you're looking at the design of the program itself, and a little bit beyond accessibility is, well, what's encouraging and what's reinforcing to the individual as well, in terms of what is something, an output that would encourage them to learn a skill or to encourage them to engage in the product, etc. So there's all sorts of different interactive sets of tools that you can look at, but it just, again, you really have to listen to the audience and what sort of things that they're looking for in terms of engagement and design and layout.
Well, if that's it, Mark, do you have a question?
It's more of a comment, actually. I was just going to say you could actually hire the audience as well. So think about hiring people in your team that are facing some of the challenges, because
you got a great loud voice, Mark, but it's worth repeating with the microphone. So.
No, I was just saying you could also hire your audience. So having people that are facing some of the challenges on your actual design team, I think, is really key. So making a point of doing that is something that all of us as startups, all of us as employers in Ontario, in Canada, and the world should be thinking about doing. So. I couldn't help it.
Speaking of shameless plugs, if someone needed a service, for instance, whereby you might be able to link up entrepreneurs with potential employees, what would that service be, Mark?
It might be called Magnet.
That would be here?
Yeah, it was a program it's actually Ryerson University, but it was started with a couple of digital media zone companies actually providing the tech for it, and we just launched a fully accessible platform to actually help employers connect and hire persons with disabilities, and we have some large projects rolling out on that. So if you are looking for somebody and it's the right thing to do, definitely check it out. And thank you.
Magnet.today.
That's right.
Okay, well, thank you.
I have to get you to do a commercial.
Okay, you're on. Well, thank you all very, very much for being here this afternoon, and I want to thank everyone, Kristen Conley, the marketing manager at DMZ, and all of her associates for pulling this together and for having it so well organized. I want to thank Nadia, who is officially founder of Magnus Mode.
Founder and CEO.
Founder and CEO, even better. John Lowen, who is a design leader at Perkins as well. Thank you very much for being here. And Mayanne, founder of Access Now. Thank you for being with us and for all of you for sharing your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.